In a small, bustling courtroom filled with murmurs and shuffling papers, all eyes were locked on the woman standing confidently at the plaintiff's table. Dressed in a sharp navy blazer, her presence was commanding, and her voice didn't waver as she addressed the judge. She was here for one reason: to hold the man seated at the defendant's table accountable. Her claim was simple, or so it seemed. She had a child, and he was the father. But there was nothing simple about the way the tension thickened in the air, each word raising more questions than it answered. The man, sitting calmly across from her, seemed like a pillar of quiet dignity. His expression was a mix of confusion and frustration, though he tried to mask it. Every now and then, his deep, steady eyes flicked to the woman, as if searching for answers that her accusations refused to give. He shook his head slightly, disbelief etched on his face, but he remained silent, letting his lawyer handle the objections and procedural exchanges. To anyone watching, his calmness might have been mistaken for indifference, but those who truly paid attention could see the strain just beneath the surface. The case itself was straightforward at first glance. The woman claimed the man was the father of her child and demanded financial support. However, from the moment she presented her story, the courtroom buzzed with quiet skepticism. Her narrative was passionate, even detailed, but something about the way she delivered it, hesitant pauses here and there, a faint tremble in her voice when pressed on specifics, didn't sit right with everyone. The judge, an experienced and sharp-minded individual, leaned forward in their seat, keenly observing every word, every facial twitch, as if they could see beyond what was being said. The child in question wasn't present in court that day, and that absence alone seemed to weigh heavily on the proceedings. The woman had presented photographs of her toddler, a sweet, smiling face with bright eyes that would melt the hardest hearts. She described the hardships she had faced raising the child alone, painting a picture of struggle and resilience. She portrayed herself as a victim of abandonment, a single mother fighting for justice and fairness. "I have carried this burden alone for too long," she said, her voice trembling just enough to tug at the emotions of the jury and audience. The man, however, was resolute in his denial. "Your Honor," his lawyer said during the opening arguments, "my client has never met this woman prior to these proceedings. He has no connection to her or her child, and we have evidence to prove it." A murmur rippled through the room. The tension escalated as the lawyer produced flight records, emails, and witnesses willing to testify to the defendant's whereabouts during the alleged time of conception. Still, the woman stood firm, shaking her head in defiance. "He's lying," she whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the edge of her table. As the hearing progressed, the woman's testimony became more impassioned, her claims growing increasingly specific. She recalled moments that only two people could possibly share, recounting dates and details that she insisted proved the man was the father of her child. But each time her story seemed airtight, the defense would poke holes, presenting counterarguments that left the courtroom teetering on a knife's edge of uncertainty. The judge, who had maintained a neutral and observant demeanor throughout, finally raised a hand to silence the back and forth. "Enough," they said, their tone firm but measured. "This matter hinges on evidence, not speculation. We'll proceed with the DNA test results." The air grew thick as the judge's words settled over the room like a heavy fog. Both parties exchanged tense glances, each convinced the results would validate their side of the story. When the clerk handed over the sealed envelope containing the DNA results, the courtroom fell into a hushed silence. All eyes were on the judge as they opened it, their expression unreadable. The woman shifted in her seat, her confident demeanor faltering for the first time. The man sat motionless, his hands clasped tightly together, as if bracing himself for impact. The judge scanned the document, their brow furrowing ever so slightly. They looked up, first at the woman, then at the man, and finally at the courtroom as a whole. "According to the results," the judge began, their voice steady but deliberate, "the defendant is not the biological father of the child." A gasp echoed through the room. The woman's face went pale, her mouth opening as if to speak. But no words came out. The man blinked in shock, a mixture of relief and confusion washing over him. For a moment, it seemed like the case would end there, the truth finally revealed. But then the judge cleared their throat and leaned forward, their gaze piercing through the tension like a blade. However, they continued, their voice now tinged with something that made the room hold its collective breath. This result does not absolve all responsibility. There is more to this story than meets the eye. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Lawyers scrambling, whispers spreading like wildfire among the spectators. The woman's face twisted with a mixture of shock and panic, while the man's confusion deepened. The judge raised their hand again, commanding silence, but the tension in the room was palpable. What could they mean by more to this story? What revelation could possibly shift the narrative now? As the judge prepared to reveal the next piece of information, the room seemed to collectively lean forward, every heart pounding in anticipation. Whatever was about to be said would change the lives of everyone involved forever. And with that, the story teetered on the edge of an even deeper mystery, leaving everyone wondering, what truth was still waiting to be uncovered? The judge's words hung heavy in the air, their meaning unclear but undeniably loaded. Everyone in the courtroom felt it. A shift, as if the ground beneath them had suddenly become unsteady. The woman sat frozen, her face betraying a storm of emotions. Disbelief, panic, and something else, something harder to define. Her fingers nervously twisted the edge of her blazer, a small gesture that gave away what her carefully composed face tried to conceal. Across the room, the man stared at the judge, his brow furrowed in confusion. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but closed it again, unsure of what to even ask. The judge set the papers down carefully, their movements deliberate, almost as though they were buying time. Finally, they spoke again, their voice low but firm. "Miss," they said, turning their attention fully to the woman, "there are inconsistencies in your claims that we cannot ignore. Before proceeding, I want to give you an opportunity to explain something." The woman stiffened, her jaw tightening. "What inconsistencies?" she asked, her voice sharper now, as if her confidence was returning, or perhaps it was just a defense mechanism. "I've told you everything. I don't understand what you mean." The judge's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in the way someone looks when they're trying to solve a particularly difficult puzzle. They glanced briefly at the defense lawyer before continuing. "You've presented a compelling case," the judge said carefully, "but certain elements of your testimony contradict the timeline we've reviewed. For example, you stated that the conception occurred during a specific time frame, yet the defendant has provided evidence placing him in another state during that period. That evidence could be faked." The woman shot back quickly, her tone defensive. "You think he wouldn't go to those lengths to avoid taking responsibility?" The man's lawyer rose to object, but the judge silenced them with a raised hand. "Miss," the judge said again, their voice calm but firm, "the DNA test is conclusive. The defendant is not the biological father of your child. That's a fact we cannot dispute. However, what remains unclear is your reasoning for bringing this case in the first place." The room seemed to shrink as the weight of the judge's words settled in. The woman's lips parted as though she wanted to argue, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted toward her lawyer, who looked equally lost for words. For the first time, a crack appeared in her confident facade, a glimpse of vulnerability that she hadn't shown before. I just want what's best for my child," she finally said, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "You don't understand what it's like, raising a child alone. I've done everything I can, but it's not enough. I thought he should be held accountable." The judge's gaze didn't waver. "And what made you believe he was responsible?" There was a long pause, the kind that made everyone in the room hold their breath. The woman hesitated, her eyes darting around the courtroom as though searching for an escape. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. Because someone told me he was." The words landed like a bombshell. A ripple of surprise swept through the courtroom, and even the man at the defendant's table couldn't hide his shock. His brows knit together as he leaned toward his lawyer, whispering something urgently. The judge raised an eyebrow, their interest clearly piqued. "Someone told you," they repeated, their tone laced with curiosity. "Who exactly?" The woman hesitated again, her fingers now twisting a strand of her hair. "It doesn't matter," she said, almost too quickly. "What matters is that my child deserves a better life." "It does matter," the judge countered, their tone firmer now. "If this claim was based on information provided by a third party, we need to understand the source and their motives. You've brought a serious allegation to this court, one that impacts not just you and your child, but the defendant as well. We cannot move forward without the truth." The woman looked down, her face flushed. She seemed to be weighing her options, deciding how much she was willing to reveal. Finally, she let out a shaky breath. It was someone who said they knew him. "Someone I trusted." "Can you name this individual?" the judge pressed. Her eyes flicked toward the man at the defendant's table, then back to the judge. She looked as though she might refuse, but then something seemed to change. Her shoulders sagged slightly, the fight draining out of her. "It was an old friend," she admitted quietly. "Someone I went to school with. They told me he had to be the father, that they'd seen us together." The defendant's lawyer immediately jumped to their feet. "Your Honor, this testimony is hearsay at best," they said, their voice sharp with frustration. "There's no evidence to support these claims." "I'm inclined to agree," the judge said, their tone thoughtful. "But before we dismiss this entirely, I'd like to ask one more question." They turned to the woman, their expression softer now, almost compassionate. "Miss, why would this friend make such a claim? Were they mistaken, or do you believe there was another motive at play?" The woman hesitated, biting her lip. For a moment, she seemed on the verge of tears. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought they were trying to help me. But now I'm not sure anymore." The courtroom was silent, the weight of her words sinking in. The judge leaned back in their chair, their expression unreadable. "This complicates matters," they said finally. "We'll need to investigate this further before we can come to any conclusions." The woman looked down at her hands, her face a mixture of shame and fear. The man at the defendant's table stared at her, his expression unreadable. Whatever emotions he was feeling, anger, confusion, or perhaps even pity, he kept them carefully hidden. As the judge called for a recess, the room erupted into a low hum of whispered conversations. The woman remained seated, staring at the table in front of her, while the man stood and quietly conferred with his lawyer. The tension in the room was palpable, the mystery far from resolved. Outside the courtroom, reporters and onlookers speculated wildly, their imaginations running rampant with theories about the case. Who was the mysterious friend who had planted the seed of doubt in the woman's mind? Why had she been so convinced that the man was the father, despite the lack of evidence? And most importantly, what was the truth about the child's paternity? As the parties prepared to return to the courtroom, it was clear that this case was far from over. The answers lay just out of reach, tantalizingly close yet shrouded in uncertainty. Whatever revelations awaited, they would undoubtedly send shockwaves through the lives of everyone involved. And as the doors to the courtroom closed once more, the audience was left on the edge of their seats, desperate to know what would happen next. The courtroom reconvened with a sense of unease hanging over everyone present. The woman sat stiffly at her table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She avoided the defendant's gaze entirely, focusing instead on a spot in the middle of the judge's bench. It was clear that the weight of her decision to come forward, fueled by advice from this mysterious friend, was now pressing down on her. Across from her, the man sat quietly, his demeanor calm but his eyes sharp, watching every movement, every hesitation, as though trying to piece together the puzzle himself. The judge entered, their expression unreadable but their presence commanding. The room fell silent as they began speaking. After reviewing the testimony and the evidence presented, it's clear there are still significant gaps in this case. However, the court cannot ignore the possibility that additional parties may have influenced this situation. With that in mind, I've authorized a subpoena to question the individual who allegedly provided this information. The woman's head snapped up in alarm, her face suddenly pale. "You can't," she blurted out before quickly catching herself. Her lawyer placed a hand on her arm, a silent attempt to calm her, but the damage was already done. The room buzzed with whispers, and even the defendant looked taken aback by her reaction. "Miss," the judge said, their voice firm but not unkind, "I understand this is difficult for you, but the integrity of this court depends on uncovering the truth. If there's more to this story, we need to hear it." The woman swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously toward the exit as though she were considering fleeing the room. Finally, she sank back into her chair, defeated. "Fine," she muttered, barely audible, "but I don't think they'll come." The judge ignored her comment and gestured for the bailiff to proceed. Within moments, the doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and a tall, slightly disheveled man was escorted inside. He looked uncomfortable, tugging at the collar of his shirt and glancing around as though he'd rather be anywhere else. The woman tensed visibly at the sight of him, her eyes narrowing, while the defendant's expression remained unreadable. "State your name for the record," the judge instructed. The man cleared his throat, his voice rough with nerves. My name is Robert," he said. His eyes flicked toward the woman, then quickly away, as if he couldn't bear to meet her gaze for too long. "Robert," the judge said evenly, "it's been alleged that you provided information to the plaintiff suggesting that the defendant was the father of her child. Is that true?" Robert shifted uncomfortably, his hands fidgeting at his sides. Yeah, I said something like that," he admitted, his voice barely above a mumble. "But I didn't think it would go this far." The woman shot him a glare that could have melted steel. "You didn't think it would go this far?" she hissed under her breath, her voice dripping with disbelief. "You told me he was the father. You said you knew. How could you lie about something like that?" The judge raised a hand to silence her. "Miss, please," they said firmly. "Let him speak." Robert's face turned a deep shade of red, and he looked down at the floor. "Look, I'm sorry," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. I thought I was helping. You were going through so much, and I wanted to make it better. I figured if you had someone to blame, maybe it would help take some of the pressure off." "Helping." The woman's voice cracked, and tears welled in her eyes. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you even care about what this has done to me, to my child?" The courtroom was silent, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone like a heavy blanket. Even the defendant seemed taken aback, his previously stoic expression softening for just a moment. Robert finally looked up, his face a mixture of shame and regret. "I didn't think it would go this far," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for this to happen." The judge leaned forward, their gaze sharp. "Robert, did you have any reason to believe the defendant was the father of this child? Or was this claim based purely on speculation?" Robert hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as though searching for the right words. Finally, he shook his head. "I didn't have proof," he admitted. I heard things. People talking. I thought maybe it was true." "People talking," the judge repeated, their tone incredulous. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've done? You provided false information that led to a court case involving not just the plaintiff and defendant, but an innocent child as well." Robert looked like he wanted to crawl under the nearest table and disappear. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." The judge's expression was stern. "Sorry doesn't undo the damage caused by your actions. The consequences of this case reach far beyond these walls. You've created confusion and pain for everyone involved, including a child who has no say in this matter." The tension in the room was almost unbearable. The woman sat with her face buried in her hands, silently weeping, while Robert stood awkwardly, unsure of what to do or say. The defendant remained seated, his hands clasped tightly together, as though trying to hold himself steady. Finally, the judge addressed the room. This case is a reminder of the responsibility we all bear to act with honesty and integrity. The court will now take all of this into consideration before issuing a final decision. With that, the judge called for another recess, leaving the room buzzing with tension and unanswered questions. The woman remained seated, her shoulders shaking as silent tears fell. Robert slunk out of the courtroom as quickly as he could, avoiding everyone's gaze. As the defendant stood to leave, he hesitated for a moment, his eyes lingering on the woman. There was something in his expression, an unspoken thought, a mixture of frustration and empathy. But he said nothing, turning and walking out the door with his lawyer by his side. The audience was left to wonder, what would happen next? Would the truth finally come out, or had the tangled web of lies and half-truths become too complex to unravel? One thing was certain, the answers were just within reach, but they promised to bring even more turmoil before any resolution could be found. The courtroom was heavy with silence as everyone filed back into their seats after the recess. The air felt thick with unanswered questions, and the lingering tension hung over the room like a storm cloud, waiting to burst. The woman wiped her eyes quickly, trying to compose herself, though the weight of the moment still seemed too much to bear. Her mind was a whirlwind, spinning with confusion and hurt. She had trusted Robert, had believed his words, had clung to the idea that her search for the truth was finally coming to an end. But now, everything she thought she knew had been called into question. The judge entered once again, their expression unreadable. Without a word, they took their seat and glanced down at the papers before them. The room fell into an uneasy hush. Everyone waited, on edge, for the next move. "Miss," the judge said, breaking the silence, "you have admitted that the information you received was based on hearsay, and that you did not have concrete evidence to support your claim. However, the court has taken this into account, and the legal process must continue." The woman's heart sank as the judge's words echoed in her ears. She had known, deep down, that there would be consequences for her actions. But hearing it from the judge's mouth made the reality feel sharper, colder. She had dragged everyone into this, and now it was all unraveling before her. "Your Honor," her lawyer interjected, trying to regain some control of the situation, "we still believe there is merit to this case. Our client was led to believe in good faith that the defendant was responsible. We urge the court to consider the broader implications of this." The judge nodded thoughtfully but said nothing further, their eyes scanning the room. Then, without warning, they looked directly at the defense attorney. "I believe we've reached a critical juncture in this case," the judge said, their tone suddenly changing. "Perhaps there's more to this than we have seen." A sharp silence followed. The defense lawyer shifted uncomfortably, their face betraying just a flicker of uncertainty. "Your Honor, I must insist that the defendant has no connection to this woman or her child. We have presented irrefutable evidence to that effect." The judge held up a hand, signaling for the lawyer to stop. "I understand," they said, "but I must inform you that the investigation is not yet complete." They paused, their gaze piercing. "In fact, we've just uncovered new information that may change everything." The woman's breath caught in her throat. New information. Her heart began to race as she glanced toward the defense table. What could it possibly be? Had someone else been involved? Had the truth about her child's father been hidden even deeper than she had imagined? The judge's voice broke through her swirling thoughts. "A few days ago, we received a sealed document, one that had been deliberately withheld from this court. It contains a confession, one that might alter the course of these proceedings." A murmur spread through the room like wildfire. The woman's stomach churned as her mind raced, trying to piece together what could possibly be in that document. The defense lawyer's face paled slightly, but they quickly regained their composure, standing firm. Your Honor, the defense lawyer began, their voice tight. I must object. If new evidence has been introduced without our knowledge, it is a violation of due process. The judge held up a hand, silencing the objection. This evidence was only recently brought to light, and I believe it's crucial to the integrity of this case. The court will proceed with caution. As the judge spoke, the woman's thoughts were in turmoil. She could barely process the words. A confession. Who had confessed to what? Was this the final piece of the puzzle, or was it another twist in the already complex story? The judge motioned to the bailiff, who stepped forward with the sealed document. The room held its breath as the judge slowly unsealed the envelope and pulled out the papers. They scanned the contents briefly, their face neutral, but something in their eyes shifted, an unreadable flicker that caught everyone's attention. Miss, the judge said, their voice low, this document reveals that there is a third party involved, someone who has been in contact with both you and the defendant. The woman's face went white. A third party. What did this mean? She had believed Robert's words, had trusted that he was acting out of kindness, out of a sense of helping her. But now, this new revelation twisted the narrative even further. Your Honor, the defense attorney interjected quickly. This cannot be admissible. We have no knowledge of this document. We cannot proceed with such an explosive accusation without knowing its source or its validity. The judge glanced at the document again, then back at the defense attorney. I understand your concerns, but I believe it's vital that we explore this avenue. It seems that both the plaintiff and the defendant have been manipulated by someone else, a person with a hidden agenda. The words hung heavy in the room, and the woman's heart began to pound in her chest. Who was this third party? Had someone been playing both sides, orchestrating this entire situation for their own gain? Who is it? The woman's voice trembled as she finally asked the question that had been swirling in her mind. Who's behind all of this? The judge's gaze softened, but their voice was firm. It seems, Miss, that the person responsible for introducing this false claim is someone very close to you. A cold chill ran down the woman's spine as her mind raced, trying to grasp the full implication of the judge's words. What? What are you talking about? The judge leaned forward, their voice calm but resolute. It appears that your former friend, Robert, was not acting alone in his deception. There is another individual, someone you know very well, who has been working behind the scenes to manipulate this situation. The woman felt as though the floor had dropped out beneath her. Her knees shook, and her vision blurred as the weight of the revelation struck her. She had trusted Robert, had leaned on him in her time of need. But now, the idea that someone else, someone she knew, had been involved in this scheme was almost too much to bear. The defense attorney seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. Your Honor, this is a serious accusation, they said, their voice shaky with the realization of the potential ramifications. Are you suggesting that the plaintiff herself was in on this? I'm not suggesting anything, the judge replied, their voice steady but tinged with a quiet urgency. I'm stating what the evidence indicates. We will continue to investigate this matter, but it seems clear now that there are deeper forces at play. The woman could barely breathe. Who could it be? Who had been manipulating her, leading her down this path of lies and confusion? She thought of all the people in her life, family, friends, and none of them seemed to fit the picture that the judge was painting. As the realization slowly dawned on her, the courtroom waited in tense silence, all eyes on her. She had been swept up in a web of deceit, and the truth was just beginning to unravel. But the more she tried to grasp at the pieces, the more they seemed to slip away, out of her reach. The stakes had never been higher, and with each passing moment, the tension mounted, threatening to break. The courtroom buzzed with an undercurrent of disbelief, the air thick with anticipation as the judge's words echoed in the minds of everyone present. The woman's hands trembled as she tried to process what had just been revealed. A third party, someone she knew, someone close to her, had been orchestrating this entire mess. Her mind raced, spinning in circles as she tried to figure out who could be behind the deception. The judge's gaze softened, but the tension was still palpable. "Miss," they said, turning their attention back to her, "I understand that this is difficult, but we need to uncover the truth. This document clearly implicates someone you know, and it's crucial that we get to the bottom of it." The woman's breath caught in her throat. "Who?" she whispered, almost pleading. "Who is it? Who has been behind all of this?" The judge sighed, their voice calm but filled with an unmistakable weight. "It seems that the one who's been pulling the strings is your sister." The woman's eyes widened, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. Her sister. She had always trusted her, always thought she had her best interests at heart. But now, everything she thought she knew about her family was shattered. How could her own sister be involved in something like this? The room fell silent as the weight of the judge's words sunk in. The defense attorney was the first to speak, his voice faltering. "Are you suggesting that the plaintiff's sister was the one who initiated all of this? That she's been manipulating both the plaintiff and the defendant?" The judge nodded slowly. "Yes. According to the evidence we've uncovered, your sister has been feeding Robert false information about the defendant and encouraging him to spread the story. All of this was orchestrated to create the illusion that the defendant was the father, all while she remained in the background, pulling the strings." The woman's head spun, and she felt as though the ground beneath her had shifted. She had trusted her sister more than anyone else in her life, had relied on her for support through some of her hardest moments. But now she realized she had been living a lie. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound could. "Why?" the woman asked, her voice breaking. "Why would she do this?" The judge's face softened with empathy. "That, I believe, is something only your sister can answer. But what we do know is that her actions have caused great harm, and the consequences will be severe." The woman could barely keep her composure as she thought back to the times when her sister had offered her advice, comforted her during the most challenging parts of her life. All of it felt like a carefully crafted illusion now, a web of lies designed to manipulate her. Her thoughts were interrupted as the doors to the courtroom opened, and in walked her sister, a look of defiance on her face. The woman's heart stopped. How could she show her face after everything that had been revealed? Her sister's eyes met hers briefly, and for a split second, there was a flicker of something, guilt, perhaps, but it was quickly replaced by cold resolve. "You think you've won, don't you?" Her sister sneered, her voice dripping with contempt as she made her way to the defendant's table. "You think just because you found out that I was behind all of this, everything will be fixed. Well, you're wrong." The woman's throat tightened as her sister spoke, each word a blow to her already fragile heart. "You've lied to me," she cried, her voice raw with pain. "You've manipulated me, made me believe that this man was the father of my child when all along you knew the truth." Her sister smirked, clearly unfazed by the emotional outburst. "You were always too naive," she said, her tone mocking. "I did what needed to be done. I saw you struggling, and I thought if I could give you a reason to hold on to, a reason to fight, maybe you'd finally stop wallowing in your pity. I made sure you had someone to blame, someone to fight for, someone to focus on." The woman shook her head, unable to process the cruelty in her sister's words. "You did this for what? To make me feel better? To control me?" She spat, her voice rising. "You destroyed everything I had, everything I believed in." The sister's expression hardened. "You should thank me," she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "I gave you something to focus on, something to fix. Without me, you'd still be lost. So don't sit there acting like I'm the villain here." The woman stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You're not a savior," she shouted, her eyes blazing with fury. "You're a liar, and you've ruined everything. You don't get to play God with my life." The courtroom was silent, the air thick with the tension between the two women. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the judge spoke, their voice steady but commanding. "Enough," they said firmly. "This behavior is unbecoming of this court. Miss, you have acted recklessly, and the damage you've caused is far-reaching. However, this court is not without mercy. We will consider all factors before making a final judgment." The woman felt as though she were standing on the edge of a cliff, the world spinning around her. Her sister had been behind the entire ordeal, manipulating her every step of the way. But there was still one question that lingered, one final twist in this already twisted tale. "Your Honor," the defense attorney spoke up, his voice cautious but firm. "There's something else we need to discuss. It seems that the defendant has some new information that may shed light on the situation." The woman's head snapped toward the defendant's table, her heart pounding. What could this new information be? Had they found something else? Something that would change everything? The defendant stood up slowly, his expression unreadable as he turned toward the judge. "I never wanted any of this," he said quietly, his voice filled with an unexpected calm. "I never wanted to be dragged into this mess. But there's something you all need to know." The woman's pulse quickened as the defendant began speaking, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I'm not the father," he said, his gaze locking with hers. "But there's someone else who might be." The revelation hit her like a punch to the gut. Someone else. Who could it possibly be? Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the sudden turn in events. "I never told you this before," the defendant continued, his voice steady, "but I've been in contact with someone from your past. Someone who might have a better claim to being the father of your child." The courtroom gasped, the air thick with anticipation. The woman's hands shook, her mind reeling as the pieces slowly began to fall into place. Could it be? Could there be someone else, someone she hadn't thought about, who was truly the father? The defendant nodded solemnly. "The truth is, Miss, I wasn't the one who fathered your child. But there's someone who's been watching all of this from the sidelines, waiting for the right moment to step forward." The woman's world tilted, her head spinning. She couldn't comprehend what was happening. This was the final twist, one that had the potential to unravel everything, leaving her with more questions than answers. But before she could react, the courtroom doors burst open once again, and another figure entered, their presence undeniable. The woman's eyes widened as she saw who had entered, the one person she least expected, the person who had been silently watching, waiting for this moment to arrive. And just like that, the story took a new turn. The courtroom fell silent once again as the figure who had just entered took a step forward. The woman's eyes widened, and a gasp rippled through the room. Standing at the doorway, looking more confident than she had ever seen her, was her childhood friend, Sarah. Sarah was the last person the woman would have expected to walk through those doors. They had been close once, inseparable in their youth, but somewhere along the way, their paths had diverged. Sarah had moved away years ago, and their connection had faded over time. But seeing her now, standing in the center of this chaos, a knot tightened in the woman's chest. "Sarah," the woman whispered, almost in disbelief. Sarah's expression was calm but serious. She took a deep breath before speaking, her voice steady. "I didn't want it to come to this, but I couldn't sit in the shadows any longer." The woman's mind was reeling. What was Sarah doing here? What had she been hiding? She had been friends with Sarah for years, shared secrets, dreams, and fears. But now, in this moment, nothing made sense. Sarah had never mentioned any connection to this situation. How could she have known what was happening? "I've been following this case," Sarah continued, her gaze never leaving the woman. "And I know that you've been deceived, all of you. I never meant for any of this to go down like this." The judge, sensing the gravity of the situation, leaned forward. "Miss, please clarify your role in this matter. Are you suggesting that you have information that could change the outcome of this case?" Sarah nodded, her eyes scanning the courtroom before returning to the woman. "Yes," she said quietly, but her voice carried a sense of undeniable truth. "I'm the father." The woman's world tilted once more. The words hit her like a freight train. The father. Sarah. But how? They had been friends, not lovers. At least, that's what she had always believed. Sarah took another step forward, her voice softening. I've been hiding the truth for so long, out of fear, out of shame. But I can't let you suffer because of my lies anymore. The woman's head was spinning as she tried to comprehend what Sarah was saying. You? But how could this be? We've never. She stopped herself, shaking her head. How could you keep this from me? Sarah's expression softened with regret. I never wanted to hurt you, but I couldn't bring myself to tell you the truth. There was a time when I was scared, when I didn't know what to do. We were young, and I wasn't ready for what had happened between us. The woman's eyes welled with tears, her emotions a chaotic storm. You mean, all this time, you knew? Sarah nodded solemnly. Yes, but I never wanted to complicate your life. You had your own battles to fight. I thought maybe, just maybe, if I stayed out of it, you'd be okay. The weight of Sarah's confession was almost too much to bear. The woman's thoughts were a blur. How could Sarah have hidden such an important truth for so long? How could she have let her believe in the wrong man all these years? Why now? The woman managed to ask, her voice trembling. Why bring this up now, after everything? After all the pain? I couldn't watch you go through this alone anymore, Sarah said softly. I couldn't let you believe Robert was the one. The truth needed to come out, and I needed to step up. The courtroom was still as death, everyone watching, waiting for the final pieces of the puzzle to fall into place. The woman's mind raced, but the truth was slowly sinking in. It was Sarah. The father was her old friend, the one she had never suspected. She had spent so many sleepless nights wondering what had happened, but now everything made sense, even though it was impossible to fully accept. The judge broke the silence, their voice clear and authoritative. It seems that we have reached the truth. The identity of the father has been confirmed. They turned toward the defense table. We will need to review all evidence and adjust the case accordingly, but it is clear that the plaintiff was deceived by both the defendant and the third party. The woman couldn't look away from Sarah. But why, Sarah? Why keep this from me? Why make me go through all this pain? I was afraid, Sarah said, her voice breaking for the first time. Afraid of how you'd react. Afraid of what it would do to our friendship. I should have known that you would understand. I should have told you sooner. The woman's heart was heavy with mixed emotions. Anger, betrayal, relief, all of it crashed over her in waves. But underneath it all, there was a sense of finality, of closure. The truth was out, no matter how painful it was. The judge addressed the room again, turning to the defense attorney. It is clear that the case has taken a different direction, and the original claim made by the plaintiff is no longer valid. As for the parties involved, we will proceed with a revaluation of parental rights and responsibilities. The defense attorney nodded, though they clearly looked defeated. Your Honor, we'll comply with the new findings. It seems the real father has been revealed. The woman looked at Sarah, her thoughts still racing. For years, she had been consumed with the search for answers. She had believed she was fighting for something important, only to find out that it was her own trust, her own relationships that had been tested the most. But now, there was a sense of clarity. I don't know what to say, the woman whispered, tears running down her cheeks. I don't know how to even begin to understand all of this. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes full of remorse. I'll be here, no matter what you decide. I know it won't be easy, but I'll do whatever I can to make it right. The woman took a shaky breath, trying to steady herself. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt the weight of the situation begin to lift, even if just a little. She had the truth, and although it was painful, it was what she needed to start healing. The judge wrapped up the proceedings, their voice steady. The court will adjourn while the necessary legal proceedings take place. All parties will be contacted regarding the next steps. As the courtroom began to empty, the woman stood frozen for a moment. Her sister, the one who had started this whole chain of events, had slipped away quietly, leaving only the aftermath of her actions behind. And yet, it was Sarah who had come forward in the end, the one who had held the key to the truth. The woman looked at Sarah, her emotions still raw, but there was something different in her eyes now. Understanding, acceptance, maybe even a glimmer of forgiveness. It would take time, a lot of time, to process everything that had happened. But at least now she knew, and that, in itself, was enough to start over. As they left the courtroom together, the woman and Sarah walked in silence, each carrying the weight of the past, but also the hope of a new beginning. The journey was far from over, but at least now, they could face the future with the truth at their side.